Two. Two.
settle down. The show will begin in 2 minutes. Please settle down. The show will begin in 2 minutes. Thank you.
So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second Ambassador Rodolfo C. Severino Jr. Memorial Lecture. So to formally begin our event, we will start with an invocation of God's blessing to be followed by the Philippine National Anthem. Please all rise.
Bayan muling magtipon, awitan ng Panginoon.
Sa pikit-sariwain, pagliligtas niya sa atin.
Bayan natin alalahanin, panahon tayo'y inalipin.
Nangangalan niya'y ating sambitin, paanong di tayo inapin. Bayan muling magtipon, awitan ng Panginoon. Sa pikit-sariwain, pagliligtas niya sa atin. Bayan walang sampuli, Bayang magiliw, pelas ang sinanganan, alam ng puso, sa dibdib mo'y buhay. Lupang hinirang, duyan ka ng magiting, sa manlulupit, di ka pasisiin. Sa dagat at bundok, sa simoy at sa langit mong bukaw, may nilagang tula at awit sa paglayang minamahal. Ang kislap ng watawat mo'y tagumpay na nagdidingin, ang bituin at araw niya kailan pa may magdidilim. Lupa ng araw ng walhati pagsinta, buhay langit sa piling mo. Ang hinigaya na pag may mga apil, ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
Okay, everyone, you may take your seats. Okay, so good afternoon once again to everyone. So to start, I'd just like to point out that the inaugural Severino Lecture last year had to be held online due to the ongoing pandemic. So it is a distinct pleasure for us to finally be able to have an on-site audience. And with that, I would like to take this opportunity to greet our online audience, most of them, many of them, our own students who are tuning in today live via the Ateneo YouTube channel. Okay. So before we continue, I'd just like to say a few words about this year's lecture, which is titled The Directions and Challenges of the Marcos Jr. Administration's Foreign Policy. This event is co-organized by the Carlos P. Romulo Foundation, or CPR Foundation, and the Ateneo de Manila University. It is a program of the Ambassador Rodolfo C. Severino Jr. Endowment Fund. The fund was established in the Ateneo in August 2020 by the late Ambassador Roberto R. Romulo to honor the legacy of his mentor, Ambassador Severino, as one of the country's most respected diplomats. Before we proceed to today's discussion, may I invite Dean Charina Saloma Actedonu, the Dean of the Ateneo School of Social Sciences, to deliver the welcome remarks. Okay, Dean Saloma.
Thank you, Emil. Honorable Enrique Manalo, Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Father Roberto Yap of the Society of Jesus, President of the Ateneo de Manila University, Father Norberto Bautista, Director, Office of the University Development and Alumni Affairs, former Secretary Albert Del Rosario, and Ambassador Tony Basilio, Trustee and Executive Director of the Carlos P. Romulo Foundation for Peace and Development, respectively, Mr. Howie Severino and other members of the Severino family, esteemed members of the Diplomatic Corps, respected colleagues, guests, students, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. On behalf of the School of Social Sciences of the Loyola Schools of the Ateneo de Manila University, I welcome you warmly to the second Ambassador Rodolfo Severino Lecture by the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Honorable Enrique Manalo, on the directions and challenges of the Marcos Jr. administration's foreign policy. The inaugural Ambassador Rodolfo C. Severino Jr. Lecture on the Code of Conduct on the South China Sea was delivered by the former Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Honorable Albert Del Rosario, on the 26th of August, 2021. In the 1990s, the social sciences and the humanities underwent a global turn with an explosion of interest in social dynamics beyond the borders of the nation states. In the social sciences and the humanities, a turn refers to a change of direction within a discipline which has important consequences for that discipline. The list of other turns within the social sciences and humanities is long. It includes the cultural turn, the practice turn, and very recently, the planetary turn. The global turn was made more palpable and urgent by the need to respond to the growing interconnectedness of social processes across the planet. Over the 30 years that have passed since then, concepts and theories, methods and methodologies have been keeping up with the reality that we are becoming more interconnected. We learned the usefulness of concepts such as global citizenship, cosmopolitanism, and transnationality. We learned that corollary to transnationality is transtemporality, which highlights the importance of reckoning with historical precedents of translocal and transnational phenomena, as well as their contemporary and timeless manifestations. But there are those who say that the social sciences and the humanities, the academe in general, have not kept up with globalization. While the scale and scope of global interactions have increased exponentially, that our unit of analysis for much of the social sciences and the humanities remain at the national level at the highest. At the Ateneo de Manila University, we address this with our transnational engagements, our ways of thinking and doing beyond the borders of the nation states, which are a way for us to understand the Philippines better. This afternoon, with the Department of Political Science of the School of Social Sciences, which houses the Diplomacy and International Relations program, we will demonstrate the necessity of the global perspective and of orienting ourselves to new levels of aggregation as we seek to learn about the Marcos Jr. administration's foreign policy. I hope that the short time that we have together this afternoon will be an opportunity to learn from one another and understand more fully the impact of the increase in the scale and the scope of human interactions on our lives.
Many thanks for that insightful welcome, Dean Saloma. And now, for our opening remarks and the introduction to today's keynote speaker, we have Ambassador Tony Basilio. So he's the Executive Director of the CPR Foundation. So thank you, Ambassador Tony.
Secretary Enrique Manalo, Father Roberto Yap, distinguished members, deans and faculties of the Ateneo, friends, ladies and gentlemen, Howie, I must recognize also. Ambassador Del Rosario was supposed to deliver the opening remarks, but due to some technical difficulties, he has been unable to. So he has asked me to read his remarks. On behalf of the Carlos P. Romulo Foundation, the co-organizer of this event, welcome to the second Rodolfo Severino Lecture. This annual event is one of the major outcomes envisioned by the Rodolfo Severino Professorial Chair, which, as mentioned earlier, was founded by our late chairman, Bobby Romulo, and endowed to the Ateneo de Manila University. We thank Ateneo for the excellent arrangements. I am very grateful to the Secretary for accepting our invitation, despite his busy schedule. Bobby Romulo, who has always been a strong advocate of the career services, is, I'm sure, smiling in his grave. He would have been proud of your appointment as the country's #1 diplomat. For the public, including keen observers like myself, we are assured that the crafting of and conduct of the country's foreign policy are in the good hands of those who, by training and experience, should rightfully be doing so. And it could be no timelier than now, when the world faces the grave danger of global conflict arising from the invasion of Ukraine, and closer to home, China's growing assertiveness in the South China Sea. When the global economy is threatened by the disruption of the global supply chain, even as it struggles to recover from the consequences of the pandemic. And when we increasingly realize day by day the existential threat that climate change presents to us and especially to the future generation. In a globalized world, there is no avoiding the consequences of these challenges for us. As a small country, we cannot pretend to be able to solve all the world's challenges. But under your capable hands, we certainly can make our voices heard and influence solutions through proactive collaboration with like-minded countries, under the dictates, of course, of the national interest. We look forward to your presentation, Mr. Secretary. We wish you and the administration well in this difficult and complex task, and assure you of our support in whatever our humble capacity can provide. Thank you.
Thanks for your words, Ambassador Basilio. So now, for today's keynote speech, we have Secretary Manalo. And yes, you may take the podium. Thank you.
Father Roberto Yap, the President of the Ateneo de Manila University, Dr. Serena Saloma Akpedono, Dean of the School of Social Sciences, Mr. Octavio Espiritu, Chairperson of the Carlos P. Romulo Foundation, esteemed panelists, Dr. Carmel Abao, Dr. Fernando Aldaba, and Dr. Jennifer Oreta, and the moderator, Ms. Emily De La Cruz, Ambassador Tony Basilio, Mr. Howie Severino, distinguished guests, good afternoon. I first wish to express my gratitude to the Carlos P. Romulo Foundation for Peace and Development and the Ateneo de Manila University for inviting me to the Ambassador Rodolfo Severino Endowment Fund Lecture Series. Today's event cannot be more timely as the Philippines and the global community must navigate a fast evolving international environment. In my 4 decades with the Department of Foreign Affairs, I've witnessed how new administrations have sought to understand the context to which their foreign policy should be calibrated. The current administration of President Marcos faces the daunting task of steering our country through a historic moment, one that comes on the heels of a crippling global pandemic. In his call for global unity at the United Nations General Assembly, President Marcos Jr. identified 4 challenges to the continued survival of our global community: climate change, the development of advanced technologies, widening geopolitical polarities and sharpening strategic competitions, and continuing inequalities and inequities. These challenges exist against the backdrop of the strategic rivalry between the United States and China, especially in our region. I wish to note, however, that despite the changes in circumstances or issues of the day, the fundamental characteristics of Philippine foreign policy remain the same. They are firmly anchored on the values and principles we cherish as a nation: peace, democracy, fairness, and justice. It is also directed towards the preservation and enhancement of national security, attainment of economic security, and the promotion of the rights and well-being of overseas Filipinos. Addressing the U.S.-China rivalry head-on, President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., in his first State of the Nation address, declared that under his administration, the Philippines will stand firm in its independent foreign policy, guided foremost by its national interest, and will continue to be a friend to all and an enemy to none. He has emphasized that the Philippines will maintain good relations with all of its international partners, especially on the priority areas of agriculture and food security, energy, and climate action. In my meetings with the U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, and the Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi, I underscored the importance that we attach to our relations with their respective countries, given the key role that they both play in our pursuit of national development and of a peaceful and stable region. And as we prepare now for the ASEAN Summit in November, the Philippines has recommitted to the formulation of an ASEAN community vision that strengthens our institutions and mechanisms and enables ASEAN member states to craft regional policies and implement programs and activities with a certain degree of independence from external influences. I believe that the late Ambassador Severino, who was a champion of ASEAN and whose legacy we are honoring today, would agree that we can only operationalize, quote, ASEAN centrality if ASEAN member states develop their common aspirations and jointly strengthen ASEAN bodies to effectively address threats to regional peace and security. Our foreign policy is not premised on straddling the interests of a bipolar world. Hence, we continue to strengthen our bilateral relations with, quote, middle powers such as Japan, Korea, India, Indonesia, and Australia. Diversifying our partnerships affords us more options for development financing, ensuring market access, and generating support for our individual diplomatic initiatives and advocacies. As the President stressed at the UN General Assembly, climate change is the greatest threat affecting our nations and our peoples. Not only is the Philippines the fourth most vulnerable country to the effects of climate change, we are also one of the most disaster-prone countries in the world. That is why we will continue to call for bolder collective action against the adverse effects of climate change. We accept our share of responsibility, and we will continue to do our part to avert the collective disaster. But while our country has committed to 75% greenhouse gas emissions reduction and avoidance by 2030, this target can only be reached with the support of our developed partners, especially the bigger countries. The upcoming Conference of Parties of the UNFCCC, or the COP27 in Egypt, is crucial as we work towards climate justice and urge our bilateral and multilateral partners to fulfill their commitments to provide climate financing, technology transfer for adaptation for the most vulnerable and developing countries, and to cut their greenhouse gas emissions. At the same time, we want to strengthen international mechanisms and frameworks to reduce disaster vulnerability and to build resilience. As a signatory to the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the Philippines advocates for inclusive disaster governance that considers the interests of the most vulnerable and marginalized. Despite the challenges of the pandemic and the global economic upheavals, the Philippines remains on track to reach upper middle income status by next year. With steady investment in food, public health, education, and other social services, we expect to become a moderately prosperous country by 2040. Our particular priority is investment in food security and in a modern and resilient agriculture. This administration frames the post-pandemic economic agenda not merely around recovery, but around transformation. President Marcos Jr.'s goal is to transform our economy to one ready for the needs and demands of the 21st century. And it is just not to restore things to the way they were before the pandemic, but in fact to have policy thrusts in programs that could serve us well and to do better and achieve more. At the same time, resilient economic growth, such as development of infrastructure and smart cities, instituting structural reforms that promote ease of doing business, and investing in digital technologies remain also top priorities. A policy of transformation requires addressing and understanding the development of advanced technologies. As the President said, they could solve many of our old problems, but they could also disrupt our political and social orders, including possible displacement of human labor as a result of advances in automation. And so our governance structures must keep up. Transformation also asks that even as we grapple with these new long-term shifts, we must continue to cut down inequalities and inequities within and among countries, as exemplified by access to vaccines and the widening digital divide. To this end, this administration will maximize the use of public and private resources to encourage the expansion of trade, investment, and technology transfers to accelerate our sustainable development. We have also revitalized our participation in several multilateral economic fora to broaden our engagements beyond our traditional partners. Examples of these are the Asia Cooperation Dialogue, which includes the Middle East and Gulf Cooperation Council member states, the World Economic Forum, and the Bawao Forum for Asia. We are also working within APEC, our main platform for collaborative engagement within the economies of the Asia-Pacific region, in tackling imminent and forward-looking issues such as food and energy security, supply chain resilience, and innovation and digitalization. Our bilateral engagements are similarly oriented. On the issue of the West Philippine Sea or the South China Sea, the President has made very clear that we will not surrender even a single inch of our territory, and that we will continue to uphold our sovereignty, sovereign rights, and jurisdiction. We are cognizant that the situation in the South China Sea is a strategic challenge that cannot be readily solved. The Philippines, as a goal, wants the South China Sea to be a sea of peace, stability, and security. But this can only be realized through an international rules-based order and the peaceful resolution of disputes. The President has stated it clearly. The Philippines is committed to an open, inclusive, and rules-based international order that is governed by international law and informed by the principle of equity and of justice. And as the President said in the UN General Assembly last month, this commitment is reflected in our solid contributions to the cause of peace and justice. By shepherding the Manila Declaration of 1982, we helped affirm that differences should only be solved through peaceful means. By reinforcing the predictability and stability of international law, especially the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, we provided an example of how states should resolve their differences through reason and through right. That is why UNCLOS and the 2016 award on the South China Sea arbitration are the twin anchors of our policies and strategies on the West Philippine Sea / South China Sea. This year's twin celebration of the 40th anniversary of the UNCLOS and the 20th anniversary of the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea is an opportunity to highlight that UNCLOS, or the UN Convention of Law on the Sea, underpins the DOC, or the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea, and that there would be no international community without international law and trust. So even as we continue to uphold the arbitral award, a peaceful resolution of disputes and self-restraint, we cannot accept unilateral actions that push the region into instability and eventually into an unprecedented arms race. We have consistently and will continue to protest actions and activities that contribute to the militarization of both the West Philippine Sea or the South China Sea, and that cause irreparable damage to the marine environment. Widening geopolitical polarities and sharpening strategic competition are transforming the international political landscape. The ongoing Ukraine-Russia crisis is an example how one conflict can affect the entire world, given the interdependent nature of modern national economies. We urge all those concerned to exert every effort and continue utilizing diplomatic and peaceful means to end this conflict and therefore alleviate the suffering not only of the people in the Ukraine and in the region, but also globally. The crisis has produced a global domino effect on basic goods and services, from the price of fertilizers, because Russia is a major fertilizer exporter, to the price of wheat, because Ukraine is a major wheat exporter, to logistics problems, economic uncertainty due to rising inflation in all countries, and food insecurity. In fact, one of the main challenges with the Philippines, and the President is fully cognizant of this, is how to position itself in this environment as a net importer of major food items when many countries are talking about achieving self-sufficiency in their own food production due to the Ukraine crisis as well as, for example, climate change. We are closely following the security implications of the conflict in Ukraine, including the possible use of nuclear or chemical weapons. Nuclear weapons continue to pose an existential threat, despite global efforts to build norms that resoundingly prohibit them. We must reject the notion of deterrence and remain committed to decreasing the global stockpile of nuclear weapons. At the same time, we must also address the scourge of the proliferation of all weapons, be they small arms, light weapons, or improvised explosive devices. On migration and consular services, the Philippines will continue to be a leader in the promotion of migrants' rights, international migration governance, and the implementation of the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, known as the GCM. The creation of the Department of Migrant Workers has made the Philippines the first and only country in the world to include in its domestic law an explicit provision on the progressive realization of the 23 objectives of the GCM. We will lead by example and show that protecting migrants is a shared responsibility of all members of the global community. Consular services are what the general public think of when the DFA is mentioned. In fact, they lend a practical role to the country's foreign policy as they concretize our partnerships with other nations. Tourism and people-to-people exchanges would not be possible without the passports and visas that the DFA issues. The visa agreements we negotiate are key to preserving our national security and promoting economic diplomacy, allowing the government to attract more foreign tourists and investors while protecting our people and borders. Likewise, all overseas Filipino workers pass through the DFA before being deployed abroad, whether by applying for a passport or by having their public documents authenticated or apostilled. In closing, I hope I've been able to give you at least an idea of the lay of the land or the issues that the Department of Foreign Affairs has to contend with. There are, of course, quite a number of others, but perhaps we can address them later in the Q&A. But nevertheless, I hope that what I presented this afternoon will give you some kind of idea, not only of what we do, but of the challenges that we are facing today, whether they be of a regional or global nature. And these numerous challenges, when it comes to our foreign policy, will certainly be a very important aspect that we need to consider, especially as we move forward with the active participation and support of our fellow countrymen. Thank you very much, and good afternoon.
Thank you very much, Secretary Manalo, for outlining the department's foreign policy priorities in this administration, the lay of the land, as you did say. So before we proceed to hearing from our distinguished panelists, I would like to remind our audience, both online and on-site, that we do have an open forum section after our panelists speak. So for our on-site audience, we have microphones here in the center and over to your left. You may approach them later. And for our online audience, please submit your comments, your questions in the live chat. Okay. So let's see. Okay, let us now proceed to hear from our panelists. Let us begin with Dr. Fernando Aldaba, Professor of Economics at the Ateneo Department of Economics. May I invite Dr. Aldaba to go up to the podium? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Secretary Manalo, for a succinct presentation of the directions and challenges of the new administration's foreign policy. Let me just share 6 points related to Secretary Manalo's speech. First, one cannot fail to notice the role of economics in almost every aspect of Secretary Manalo's speech, from the US-China rivalry to the West Philippine Sea issue and to the Ukraine-Russia war. Economics play a big part, whether it is about the consequences of such events or whether economic tools and sanctions are being used to influence such events. Some experts say that we are entering this new geo-economic world order, characterized by the clear use of economic instruments to achieve strategic security goals. This increased convergence of economic and security thinking and strategies is likely to lead to a significant restructuring of the laws and institutions that govern international trade and investment. China, for example, has invested so much in terms of the establishment of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Belt and Road Initiative, and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, where it acts as a leader. The US, meanwhile, recently launched the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity with 14 founding member nations. The US, with other G7 members, also kicked off the Build Back Better World Initiative to counter the Belt and Road Initiative. This new geo-economic world order, highlighted by the US-China rivalry, as mentioned by Secretary Manalo, is the context wherein the Philippine economy and the new administration itself will need to navigate. Secondly, in terms of our multilateral trade and investment engagements, the Senate still needs to ratify our membership in RCEP, or the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Using a computable general equilibrium model to simulate the impact of RCEP on the Philippine economy, Dr. Cororaton, a colleague in Virginia Polytechnic, finds that RCEP as growth promoting, welfare improving, and poverty reducing for the Philippines. Income inequality will also decline. There will be positive net exports for the economy as the increase in exports exceeds the improvement in imports. Consumer prices will also decrease and all factor prices will improve. The increase in factor prices plus the reduction in consumer prices leads to higher real income of households, which in turn reduces poverty. The Gini coefficient, a measure of inequality, also decreases. So note that our failure to ratify RCEP will reverse the above positive results. At the same time, we also joined the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework last May 2022, together with 11 other countries, which included the US and 6 other ASEAN member countries. The Indo-Pacific region is home to half of the world's population and over 60% of global GDP. RCEP participating countries, meanwhile, account for only about 30% of the global GDP and 30% of the world population. The country is also poised to join the Comprehensive and Progress Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP. Dr. Cororaton also ran a simulation for this and found positive results for the Philippine membership in this free trade agreement. As we all know, aside from these economic arrangements, the Philippines is also involved in APEC and in the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement. While individually these arrangements are favorable to the Philippines, we must be cautious with a problem called the noodle bowl effect. According to prominent trade economist Jagdish Bhagwati, this noodle bowl effect is where there are too many crisscrossing FTAs that would allow countries to adopt discriminatory trade policies and reduce the economic benefits of trade. What happens too is that transaction and administrative costs associated with an array of multiple overlapping FTAs typically increase, especially for firms engaged in global trade. Thirdly, we are also happy to note that with regard to the West Philippine Sea issue, the President, as Secretary Manalo mentioned, made it very clear that we will not surrender even a single millimeter of our territory and that we will continue to uphold our sovereignty, sovereign rights, and jurisdiction. The underlying interest related to the West Philippine Sea is the wealth of its blue economy. The waters of the West Philippine Sea are home to a vast array of marine resources ranging from oil and gas reserves deep beneath the surface to the complex and beautiful ecosystems capable of supporting international seafood markets and unraveling scientific mysteries. It epitomizes the rich marine diversity of our country. In its waters, scientists have discovered hundreds of species of fish, coral, seagrass, and other marine life. These habitats not only provide the fish that fill Filipino fishing vessels and plates of Filipino families, they also serve as spawning grounds for schools that populate seas throughout Southeast Asia. Philippine scientists believe that some of the species unique to these waters may also hold the key to biomedical breakthroughs, while climate researchers can study ecosystem changes to measure human impact on the environment. Marine conservation begins with securing territorial integrity. Data from the Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources show that an estimated 324,312 metric tons of aquatic products were procured from the West Philippine Sea in 2020, translating to 7% of the total fisheries production that year. According to BIFAR, thousands of fisherfolk indeed benefit from the West Philippine Sea, especially those coming from Ilocos, Central Luzon, Mimaropa, and parts of NCR. In the ASEAN Summit 2020, ASEAN leaders reaffirmed the importance of maintaining the South China Sea or the West Philippine Sea as a sea of peace, stability, and prosperity. Fourthly, we are also very glad that Secretary Manalo mentioned that one of the key developments we need to face is the very fast advancement of technologies. We are already on the cusp of the fourth industrial revolution. Recent technological advancements are creating new prospects for the production of and the delivery of goods and services. Technological drivers of the fourth industrial revolution are the development of digital, physical, and biological technologies. The digital technologies include the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, big data and cloud computing, and the digital platform or the network effects of digitization. And also physical technologies such as autonomous cars and additive manufacturing, while biological technologies include genetic engineering and neurotechnology. While consumers and welfare may be positively affected from such progress, workers also face the possibility of displacement, as was mentioned by Secretary Manalo. Thus, we must really be prepared for this, strengthening our social protection programs like unemployment insurance and emergency cash transfers for those who will be affected. But what is also important is how our industries respond to this new environment. Critical here is innovation and creativity through research and education that will drive and sustain our future economic growth. The Philippine score in the Global Innovation Index has actually increased from 31.56 in 2018 to 35.3 in 2021, and our rank improved from 73 to 51 out of 127 countries. It is also worth noting that the government is embarking on an industrial policy that promotes innovation and creativity championed by the Department of Trade and Industry and the Department of Science and Technology. There is also now the RA 11293, or the Philippine Innovation Act, which was signed into law on April 17, 2019. This law will guide the country's innovation goals and is expected to make the policy environment in the country conducive for more science, technology, and innovation efforts. More recently, the Philippine Creative Industries Development Law was enacted. It mandates the creation of a long-term plan for the promotion and development of creative industries. It aims to spur efforts to sustain excellence in Filipinos' creative endeavors through the protection of their intellectual property rights, among many other ways of support. But of course, we need adequate financing for all this, and partnership with the private sector is key. We have also incentivized skilled and talented Filipinos abroad to come back and help us in transforming our economy. This is through the Balik Scientists Act, a new law which hopefully will encourage more Filipino scientists, technologists, and experts to return to the country and share their expertise in order to promote scientific, agro-industrial, and economic development. We can learn a lot from other countries in terms of good practices and strategies. For example, we have Israel for innovation and South Korea, the K-drama, for the creative industries. And we are not alone in facing the fourth industrial revolution. ASEAN is also preparing to build a digital community. The ASEAN Digital Community envisions a digital ASEAN that is open, secure, transparent, and connected while respecting privacy and ethics in line with international best practices. A digital ASEAN that harnesses technologies to build a resilient, inclusive, integrated, and globally competitive economy. And a digital ASEAN that embraces innovation in transforming society and contributes to social progress and sustainable development. Fifth point, our economic managers also speak about a sector that can drive growth in the next few years to reach upper middle income status. And this is the mining sector. The Philippines is one of the world's most richly endowed countries in terms of mineral resources, and they say that less than 10% have actually been mined. Last month, Finance Secretary Benjamin Jokno announced the Philippines was joining the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative as a demonstration of the administration's commitment to transparency and good governance and to promote responsible mining. At the same time, he appointed a staunch advocate of transparency in mining as one of his undersecretaries. The Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, or EITI, is a global standard of transparency that requires oil, gas, and mining companies to publish what they pay to the government and the government to publish what they collect from these companies. The initiative aims to encourage countries to be more transparent in reporting the benefits they receive from their country's natural resources. Finally, we are also delighted to hear from Secretary Manalo that the Philippine economy is on its way in reaching upper middle income status by 2023 and a moderately prosperous country by 2040. The Philippines is set to become the 22nd biggest economy in the world by 2035, according to a London-based think tank, Center for Economics and Business Research. We are hoping, of course, that we'll be able to avoid the middle income trap and that poverty incidence will become single digits with such economic expansion. The middle income trap is an economic term for a country whose GDP growth rates slow down substantially when it has a GDP per capita between $10,000 to $15,000. From 101 middle income countries during the 1960s, less than 20% were able to become high income after 50 years. There are many factors that economists say lead to this middle income trap. A key reason is the lack of transition from factor-based to innovation-based growth. Countries that are stuck in the middle income trap are unable to transition from creating and exporting cheap goods to innovating and producing high-quality products. Another issue related to becoming upper middle income is the role of development assistance. Currently, only about 25% of ODA is spent in the poorest 26 countries of the world, with about 8% going to countries classified as upper middle income countries. We are hoping that during the time that we are in the upper middle income status, we can explore new approaches to development assistance and continue to collaborate with our development partners in finally eradicating poverty in the country. In closing, I would like to note that we are now confronted with a volatile, uncertain, and complex world. Fortunately, we have dedicated and competent leaders like Secretary Manalo and Secretary Jokno and other key cabinet secretaries who will help make our economy become one of the largest and most prosperous in the world very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your insights, Dr. Aldaba. And now we invite our next panelist to give her reaction. Also from the Ateneo, Dr. Jennifer Oreta is an assistant professor of political science at the Department of Political Science. Dr. Oreta, whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Secretary Manalo, for sharing with us the foreign policy directions of the current administration. My task this afternoon is to discuss the security concerns of Secretary Manalo's discussion. Security is a public good, but it is also an evolving and contested concept. Traditional security privileges the territorial integrity of states as well as its survival, and we have witnessed major and minor wars launched in the name of security. At the end of the Cold War, the international community pondered on the major question, whose security? Thus, the concept of human security discourse was born, expanding the traditional state-centric notion of security and putting the people in the front and center of the debate. In the Philippines, the concept of security is a politicized agenda. The martial law experience has politicized the police and the military, and while martial law has long been lifted, the involvement in internal security operations, especially of the military, continues to politicize the ranks, a dangerous affair given the fragility of our democratic institutions that are weakened by decades of authoritarian rule by President Marcos Sr. and the unabated corruption of political leaders. Our military is dominantly an inward-looking institution, and its capability upgrade and modernization is behind by approximately 20 years. The continued involvement of the military in internal security operation divide its attention and resources that should have been directed to protecting our territorial waters, the claim to resources especially of our fisher folks in the West Philippine Sea, and in patrolling the Sulu Sea Triangle, a backdoor route used by foreign terrorist fighters to enter our country. So given this context, I have 3 points that I want to share. The first point is on security of our territorial waters. I welcome and support the position of the government that we will not surrender even a single inch or a millimeter of our territory, and that we are committed to a rules-based regime in promoting peace, security, and stability in the South China Sea. I recognize the commitment and effort of the government in mainstreaming and upholding the 2016 Hague Tribunal ruling together with the Code of Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea. I recommend, however, that we engage ASEAN even more and even assert the ASEAN centrality in dealing with the issues, concerns, and challenges confronting the territorial disputes in the South China Sea waters. There is also a need to mainstream and educate our own people regarding the 2016 Hague ruling and the range of diplomatic options available in upholding this victory. I have had several discussions with security forces, and sadly, some of them still carry the opinion that the only way for us to assert the Hague ruling is to start a war with China, which is too simplistic in analysis and obviously fundamentally flawed in reasoning. I am of the belief that one way of strengthening our position vis-a-vis the Hague ruling is to tap the vast potential of our own people. 10% of our population, approximately 10 or 11 million, are working abroad. Imagine if the 10% are all knowledgeable about the issues in the South China Sea, about the victory that we achieved with the 2016 Hague ruling, and on the range of diplomatic options that we can do. That's 10 million talking heads and communicators. Our running joke actually is that if we want to dominate the world, we only need to train the 10% of the population. So if the 10% plus the domestic population are aware, then we can aim to develop a critical mass of our people who are aware, committed, and motivated to advocate the Hague ruling, and in my view, this can make a significant contribution in our strategy. The second point refers to the Sulu Triangle foreign terrorist fighters and the security stability in Mindanao. South China Sea should not be the sole focus when it comes to territorial waters. We also have the Sulu Triangle where we share borders with Malaysia and Indonesia. In 2016, we signed an agreement with Indonesia in border management. And in 2017, the Trilateral Maritime Patrol and the Trilateral Air Patrol, or TMP and TAP, was signed by Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, or Indo-Malphil. The TMP and the TAP was signed at the height of the Marawi siege, and the primary motivation in speeding up the signing of the agreement was the fear, especially of the Philippines, for foreign terrorist fighters to use the Sulu Triangle as the backdoor channel for foreign terrorist fighters to enter the Philippines and join the Marawi siege. The TMP-TAP was a defense cooperation agreement entered by the military and defense establishments, but operationalization of the agreement also requires the justice and law enforcement agencies. A big portion of the TMP agreement is on patrolling the Sulu waters. It's an open secret that the Sulu Triangle, as I've said earlier, is the backdoor channel for in entering the three countries. It is the route in trafficking arms and people. It is also the channel used by the Abu Sayyaf group in their kidnapping spree and other criminal activities. Among the three countries, the Philippines, however, is the weakest link vis-a-vis the capability to patrol the air and water domains. Our sea vessels are limited, if not outdated. Our air asset are all air, no asset. Of course, that's a joke. We now have some F-1 fighters, but they are still not enough. Considering the limitation of our military, we need to find other diplomatic platforms on how we can strengthen partnerships with our neighbors vis-a-vis the issue of foreign terrorist fighters. While there are already intelligence cooperation among the three countries, there should be more people-to-people engagement, formal and informal. Similar to my recommendation in mainstreaming the Hague ruling, I am a firm believer that engaging the people in security matters and in security management are the key in a more people-centered security. The whole of nation approach, after all, requires the whole of society and not just the government. So if we are to be true to the whole of nation, whole of society approach, let's engage our people more in intelligence operation and in community security management. After all, they are the ones directly affected in security, in armed violence caused by terrorism. Still on the issue of terrorism, I recommend also that the DFA work closely with the NCMF, or the National Commission on Muslim Filipinos, to monitor our OFWs, especially those in the Middle East countries, to prevent the radicalization of our OFWs, like what happened with the Malte brothers and also with the Janjalani brothers of the Abu Sayyaf. On the matter of improving our military security or contributing to the modernization, we can also explore the potential of our shipbuilders. How about we negotiate or partner with major shipping companies to craft or develop ships? This requires massive R&D, but that can be factored in the negotiation with potential partners. Strengthening the shipbuilding industry also has a direct benefit for our security or modernization equipment. During the time of President Marcos, we have a program called SRDP, or Self-Reliant Defense Posture. This was significantly downgraded during the time of President Cory Aquino. Now we are so behind with our military modernization, some sectors are actually pushing for the revival of the SRDP. If we develop our shipbuilding capability, we can also perhaps build vessels with dual function, like border patrol and exploration of water resources. As a final point on this section, let me say well done to the DFA for not letting go of the Arms Trade Treaty. The Philippines became the first ASEAN state to join the Arms Trade Treaty, 8 years ago. No? And on March 24, 2022, the Philippines deposited the instrument of ratification of ATT, or Arms Trade Treaty, to the United Nations Secretariat, becoming the 111th state party to the treaty. The ATT is an important document in curbing the transfer of illicit weapons, and I was mentioning to Secretary Manalo earlier that that our group was among the advocates in pushing forward the ATT in the Philippines. Third point is the commitment to rules-based human rights and good governance in the region and in the global community. While we are committed to neutrality, we must also remember that we are a member of the global community of nations. By joining the UN, by affirming the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other international agreements that promote freedom, justice, and peace, we have committed ourselves to promote a rules-based international order. We thus have a responsibility not just to our people, but to the global community. We must also remember that we too benefited from the international solidarity of peoples from all over during the dark period of martial law in our country. Our friends from the international community did not let go of our hand and journeyed with us in finding the light at the end of the tunnel. We were able to end the dictatorial rule, depose President Marcos Sr., and facilitate the return to democracy with the help of the global community of friends. It is now our turn to help others, and I'd like to focus on two issues, Myanmar and Ukraine. As one of the founders of ASEAN and as one of the pillars of democracy in the region, the Philippines should use the November summit in Phnom Penh in asserting the ASEAN's commitment to strengthening democracy, enhance good governance and the rule of law, and to promote and protect human rights and fundamental freedoms of people in the member states. While respecting the bedrock principles of ASEAN, the non-interference in domestic affairs and the consensus process in decision-making in the regional organization, the Philippines and other ASEAN member states must also be mindful of our responsibility to the peoples in the region. Thus, we need to put more pressure to Myanmar to move forward with the April 2021 ASEAN 5-point consensus, most especially to immediately end violence in the country, to have dialogue among parties, and to allow for humanitarian assistance by ASEAN. As for Ukraine, I also commend and support the position of the Philippine government in castigating Russia over its attack on Ukraine. President Duterte in May 2022 slammed President Putin for the killings of innocent civilians, and I hope the current administration would remain firm in this stance. I understand the Philippines' concern regarding the impact of the crisis on our desire to be self-sufficient, given that we are a net importer of major food items. However, there are also values that we must remain committed to. To quote a friend from the military, there are issues to fight for and there are issues to die for. Issues that are relevant to our quality of life, like food, water, and resources, are issues to fight for. But there are issues that are at the core of our being, the reason why we are humans, like freedom, dignity, truth, and justice. And these are the issues that we should be ready to die for. Like the ending of our national anthem, Ang Mamatay Nang Dahil Sa'yo. Together with the global community of freedom-loving nations, let's pressure Russia, particularly the Putin government, to end this thirst for power and stop the attack in Ukraine. As the UNGA 2012 resolution on human security states, people have the right to have freedom from fear, freedom from want, and freedom to live in dignity. With that, I end my discussion, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Oreta. So before we continue with our final reactor for this afternoon, I would like to remind our online audience specifically that they can submit their comments and their questions in the live chat. So now I would like to invite to the podium Dr. Carmel Abao, Assistant Professor of Political Science and Departmental Chair.
Magandang hapon po sa lahat. Thank you very much, Secretary Manalo, for your presentation. I appreciate your narration and explanation of the different facets of Philippine foreign policy under the Marcos Jr. presidency. Thank you too to my colleagues, Dr. Aldaba and Dr. Reta, for shedding light on concerns that surround the two pillars of Philippine foreign policy, economic security and national security. For my part, I will attempt to articulate concerns surrounding the third pillar, which is the protection of Filipino migrant workers. I have one comment and three questions. My comment is on the interconnectedness of the different facets of Philippine foreign policy. I think this interconnectedness is under-discussed and under-examined. And I think right now there is more of a disconnect rather than interconnectedness. Concretely, from where I sit, which is labor and migration studies, we hardly even discuss the importance of identifying allies. It doesn't matter if a country is an ally or not. We just ask, how do we protect OFWs in those countries? And I think this disconnect is concerning because knowledge in security issues should also inform migration policies and vice versa. And we all know the reality. Our migrant workers are monitored not just by the labor ministries in their in host countries, but also by Homeland Security. But we don't even talk about the impact of surveillance on our migrant workers. We also don't talk enough about the impact of global economic agreements on migrant work, or of global trends such as the Fourth Industrial Revolution. What kind of migrant workers will be important given those trends? And what new problems are migrant workers likely to face given shifts in the global political economy? Another under-examined aspect is the connection between climate change and migrant workers, on the extent of climate change as a driver of outmigration, and on the effects of climate change on migrant workers and their families, most especially on the investments of OFWs. OFWs often invest in land and property in their hometowns in anticipation of returning home. And when typhoons hit these towns, that is financial devastation on their part. How to prevent or address that problem should also be a policy concern. I hope the new government will provide spaces for studies and conversations on the interconnectedness of the three pillars of Philippine foreign policy. Now, for my 3 questions, I developed these in consultation with colleagues in 2 organizations, the Working Group on Migration, or WGM, of the Department of Political Science of Ateneo de Manila, of which I am a co-convener, and the Center for Migrant Advocacy Philippines, or CMA, of which I am a member of the board of directors. Here is our first question. How does the current government view existing mechanisms for global governance of migration? Does it see these mechanisms as necessary and sufficient? If yes, which ones and for what reasons? What labor policy or principle or values does the Philippine government want to promote at a global scale? We ask because we think it is important to know how the new government will be positioning itself in the various international organizations and forums that discuss and debate and decide on migration policy. Secretary Manalo, you mentioned the Global Compact on Migration. We have been closely monitoring the GCM ever since 2016 when the UNGA decided on the compact. We recognize the importance of getting all UN member states to agree on a common framework on migration, but we would like to ask about the strategic value of non-binding agreements over binding ones, and of setting shared objectives instead of setting global standards. This might be a false dichotomy. They probably go together, but I think it needs to be discussed because the Philippine government has always taken the route of agreeing to standards that are rights-based. We ratify ILO and UN conventions and then create national legislation in support of these conventions, from CEDAW to the Convention on Migrant Workers to the ILO core labor standards, etc. This has always been the practice until around 2007 when the Philippines, along with many states, shifted attention to the Global Forum on Migration and Development, or GFMD, which was an informal, voluntary intergovernmental body, and then the GCM in 2016. So we need to ask what the Philippine government thinks is the appropriate mechanism for the global governance of migration and why. And thus the new Philippine government believe that global consensus can be meaningful given conflicting interests of states. For example, the national security interests and need for surveillance of host countries in the global north, as against the employment and protection concerns of sending countries in the global south. Can one really talk of global governance of migration or a global consensus on migration given these conflicting interests and sovereignty concerns? Our second question is on the national governance of migration. Given the challenge of post-pandemic recovery, will there be any shift in Philippine migration policy? Will the new government further out migration, or will it focus on job creation here at home? We ask because we need to take the numbers seriously. As of July 2022, 3.7 million Filipinos had been repatriated. 2.3 million of these were OFWs. Do we advise 2.3 million Filipinos to stay here or return abroad for work? President Marcos Jr., even during his electoral campaign, has said that he will continue his father's migration policy. That policy is labor expert. Why continue a policy that is 50 years old? And why stick to labor policy of the past when conditions of the global labor market have drastically changed? Or perhaps the president doesn't really mean this, given that he has also claimed that he will prioritize jobs here. So may we just know what exactly is the current government's priority, labor export or domestic job creation? This question of prioritizing either labor export or domestic job creation is important because efforts of Philippine government actually point to the former as the continuing priority, despite rhetoric on job creation. There are at least two indications of this. One, for the Global Compact on Migration, the Philippine government has committed to prioritizing Objective 6 on ethical recruitment and Objective 12 on reintegration. Why did we not commit as well to Objective 2, which is, I quote, to minimize the adverse drivers and structural factors that compel people to leave their country of origin, end of quote. Two, we have more institutions for deployment than for reintegration. The POEA and the OWA are more than 40 years old, but the NCRO, our integration office, is only 10 years old. And now we have the new DMW, the Department of Migrant Workers, which is essentially the POEA. The direction of this new DMW is again deployment. In other words, government's pronouncement on prioritizing local job creation is not reflected in its actual efforts. We in the WGM and the CMA have always been of the view that while migration cannot be stopped overnight, it should not be furthered. We take this view on a matter of principle, that is, migration should not be forced, it should not be the first or only option of Filipino workers, and no worker should migrate for lack of job opportunities here. And we all know the social costs of migration, especially on the cohesion of Filipino families, and the costs on our women, who repeatedly suffer problems, not just because they are migrants, but because they are women. There are also ethical considerations. The reliance on OFW remittances as a development strategy, we think, is unethical. While government officially denies this in paper, we know for a fact that it is happening. I don't think anyone can refute the reality that remittances have kept our economy afloat despite crisis after crisis. And it is afloat because of our domestic workers and construction workers. In 2019, before the pandemic, remittances of these OFWs, those in elementary occupations, made up 27% of the total remittance for that year, which was 210 billion pesos. This situation begs the question, is it ethical to put the burden of keeping an entire economy afloat on the back of workers who in the first place had to go overseas because the local economy left them with very minimal job opportunities and low incomes? Our third and final question is on the relationship between the DFA and the DMW. We know that RA 11641, which created the DMW, stipulates that the new department will coordinate with DFA on the following: building relations with counterpart agencies in host countries, forging of bilateral or multilateral labor agreements, representation in international bodies concerning migration, and assessing security risks in host countries. Our concern is not coordination, because even before the DMW, coordination was already standard operating procedure. Our concern is leadership. Who will lead what, especially in host countries? How will the Migrant Workers Office, or MWO, of the DMW, which replaces the Philippine Overseas Labor Office, or POLO, operate vis-a-vis the Philippine Embassy and consulates in host countries? We know that bilateral relations can only be forged based on reciprocity, and that it is the embassy that represents the Philippines in reciprocal relations with host countries. Does this mean that the MWO will have to go through the consulate to represent the country in concerns such as processing of end-of-term benefits, sealing the coffin of dead OFWs before repatriation, etc.? This question of leadership is important because under RA 11641, the MWO is practically co-equal to the consulate. But who exactly will be the Philippine representative? The head of the MWO or the head of the consulate? If leadership is lodged in the MWO, will this new body be recognized by the host countries? Moreover, the MWO, as per the law, will focus only on OFWs. So the consulates will have to take care of the overseas Filipinos or OFs. How exactly will this be operationalized in terms of representation? Example, in the ILO, will the DMW be participating as well in labor conferences in Geneva? And how about during overseas voting? Will the COMELEC have to deputize both the MWO and the consulate? And what about assistance to nationals or responding to OFWs and OFs in distress? Will that be separate too? What will happen to the one country approach that has always guided Philippine embassies and consulates abroad? Finally, we want to ask how the Philippine government intends to cushion the effects of restructuring on affected government workers. The new DMW will affect 7 agencies: the POEA, OMWA, ILAB, POLO, NMP, NRC, and OSWA. How can government restructure without displacing workers in these agencies? And how can government restructure while saving or maximizing the institutional memory and capacities of these agencies? Thank you very much for listening to us, Secretary Manalo. We know we have raised many and difficult questions, but as they say, the devil is in the details, so we hope you won't mind explaining the details to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your incisive comments and questions, Dr. Abao. So we can let our thoughts percolate for a bit. And in the meantime, I would like to acknowledge the presence of Vice President Marlu Vilches, Vice President of the Loyola Schools. I believe she's here in the audience. There's Dr. Vilches. Thank you very much for joining us today. And I would also like to make a shout out, if you will, to our online audience. So as I mentioned earlier, a number of our participants online, they are students from the Ateneo, but we also have quite the online contingent from the University of Rizal System Pililla. So many of them political science students, but also a number from other courses. So as Pililla is quite away from our venue here in Makati, we are most appreciative that they can join us here today online. Okay. So, to get the ball rolling, I will first pose a question to our panelists and of course Secretary Manalo. And then, as mentioned earlier, we would like to invite members of the audience, both online and on-site, to submit your question. So, let me just get the ball rolling with the first question. This one is directed to Secretary Manalo as our keynote speaker. We have quite a number of questions from the audience. So for this first one, how do you think the Philippines can best operationalize middle power foreign policy while at the same time being a friend to all and enemy to none?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think you've answered the question. The best way to operationalize middle powers, from our view, is to be friends to all and enemies to none. When I say this, friends to all means we seek to take advantage of all opportunities to enhance, for example, our economic, political, security cooperation with all countries, and in a manner which is consistent with our national interests. So, in effect, by having that kind of approach, rather than a confrontational approach, we think we'll be able to at least contribute to operationalizing our achievement of middle power status, especially within the next year or two.
Okay, thank you for that, Secretary Manalo. We have a question that is, I believe, quite related. So, what are the strategic partnerships that the Philippines intends to pursue, particularly in relation to other middle powers? And what are the key issues that you and the department has identified?
Well, for example, let me take an example. In the United Nations, we are part of a group called the Middle Income Countries. And these are countries which are in very similar situations that we are. And we have, for example, common issues which are slightly different from, for example, the rest of the developing countries. And what we've done is to try and forge with them, let's say various, at least in the UN communications, citing the various issues of concern to us, such as, for example, migration, a global supply chain, etc., which are really more of concern to us, let's say, than the least developed countries. And in this way, we've been able to promote our approaches by working together. So I suppose the answer there would really be cooperating with countries who share similar concerns as the Philippines, and that's the way we intend to approach. Of course, there are other approaches that we're adopting, but I just use that as an example because there are many countries who also aspire or are almost at middle income or middle power status, and those are the countries we are tending to align with.
Okay, thanks for that once again. So appreciate the specific example of that UN group of middle income countries. So before I go to the next question, so again, our on-site audience. So for those who would like to submit questions to Secretary Manalo or our other panelists here, you may approach either the center microphone or also to that microphone to your left. Okay. So, all right. Okay. This one is a bit more, I like this one because it represents a sort of continuity from last year's lecture, also to Secretary Manalo. So in last year's Severino Fund lecture, which was, if I recall correctly, about the West Philippine Sea, the speakers, the reactors, including the former Minister of the State of Australia, expressed hopelessness for the finalization of the Code of Conduct. Are you hopeful for a future Code of Conduct regarding the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea issue?
Yes, I'm hopeful.
Very succinct. Yes. Okay. Let me see if you have other online questions. Okay. Okay. Oh, this is here. We have one from a student. Well, many of them were submitted in advance by our students, but this is from the chat. Okay. So hello. This is Ivan Nabong from fourth year AB Diplomacy and International Relations. I think this is a former student. Thank you. So I would like to ask Secretary Manalo if and how the current administration will cooperate with and strengthen relations and ties with South America in particular.
Well, already we are trying to, at least from the Philippine perspective, strengthen our ties with the countries of South America. Of course, facing some constraints, and one of them being distance. But we have, at the moment, we are currently participating in a grouping called the PEALAC, which is between the Latin American countries and countries in Asia, including a number of the ASEAN countries. They meet regularly as much as possible, but at least once every 2 years. And it's also at ministerial level. At the same time, the Philippines is an observer in the Latin American Asia Pacific Alliance, I think, and that consists of countries such as Peru, Chile, Mexico, and Ecuador, and Colombia, and the Philippines as an observer. Now, the driving force there is the fact that we see great potential in establishing relations with a number of countries in Latin America. And unfortunately, our relationship in Latin America has not been as extensive as it has been in Europe or North America. In fact, mainly our main concentration has been with the big countries, Brazil and Argentina. There's great potential in others, and Mexico, which is sad considering that the Philippines and Latin America have a common heritage. And I think that's what we're trying to accomplish. In fact, the ambassadors here of the Latin American countries have also approached me and also the president in seeing how we can further develop our bilateral ties. So while the ties are maybe not as great as we want them to be, certainly there is a commitment now to see how we can increase, let's say, visits among business groups from Latin America to the Philippines and vice versa. But this is something we have to overcome, but at least in our favor is our common heritage. We have the Spanish connection, and that's what we're trying to build on. But nevertheless, I agree this is an area where we have to really concentrate on and see how we can really further develop it and increase interest. And this includes also people to people and tourism, because that will also contribute to it. But you know, there are some constraints here. This distance, we don't have enough transportation routes. It takes. I once flew to Santiago. It took me 32 hours to get there, and vice versa when they come to the Philippines. So these are challenges, but I think they can be overcome because, as we know, countries such as Thailand and Vietnam have quite extensive relations with many of the countries. So definitely there's a commitment to do so, and we are committed to try and enhance our cooperation with the countries from Latin America.
Thank you very much, Secretary Manalo. So it's encouraging to hear that despite the geographic constraints, there's potential there for increased engagement. So with that, okay, we have one on-site attendee here. Thank you very much. So may you kindly indicate your name and affiliation and then your question. Thank you.
Yes, my name is Rodolfo Severino III, and I'm a professional educator in the United States, now returned home to the Philippines. First of all, on behalf of the Severino family, I want to thank Secretary Manalo, Ambassador Tony Basilio, and all of the distinguished leaders in honoring the memory of my father today in the second edition of the Ambassador Rodolfo C. Severino Jr. Endowment Fund Lecture Series. I cannot think of a more meaningful way to honor my father by continuing his work as a pursuer of peace, justice, and cooperation among nations. Under the first Marcos administration, we opened relations with the People's Republic of China, the establishment of which I was blessed to have the opportunity to witness as my father led the way in nurturing this relationship as charge d'affaires of our Beijing embassy. During this time in the 1970s, it seemed we had very warm relations blossoming with China. During recent decades, however, it seems China has postured herself in a very belligerent position from the Philippine perspective, as our distinguished panel has alluded to numerous times. My first question I'd like to direct towards Dr. Oreta. How has China greeted the accession of a new Marcos administration? And my second question is for Secretary Manalo. What opportunities, if any, does the current administration see to mitigate the threatening aspects of our relationship with China and reestablish friendlier and warmer Sino-Philippine relations?
Thank you very much for, I will answer first. Thank you very much for your question. And in fact, the question that you posed was the same question that a friend from China, a new friend from China, posed to me, just last week. He was a member of the party, the political party, the Communist Party, and he was actually puzzled with. He was actually asking what is the position of President Marcos vis-a-vis China when he seemed to be very friendly with the United States. So he was actually very concerned with the friendly relations or the friendly attitude of President Marcos with the United States. So I simply told him that, the policy of the administration, past and present, is, as mentioned by by Secretary Manalo, is to be friends to everyone and enemy to none. In which case, he will continue the friendly relations with the United States, but also will continue with friendly relations also with China. So I think that, but I suppose Secretary Manalo is in a better position to answer that. But That is the question posed to me by somebody from China regarding the posturing of the Marcos administration.
Thank you. So I think I'll try and answer the second question, but first let me say that I also had the great honor and privilege to have worked under your father, especially when he was the Undersecretary for Policy, and certainly he was very much a mentor to all of us when we were in the department. On your question on what the Philippines is doing, I think, as already explained, well, when the President said that we are friends to all, doesn't mean, we're going to lay on our back and let them, do whatever they want or that. Of course, we are all friends. Of course, there are differences. So even amongst friends, there are issues which we have to address, which maybe we don't agree on with. But they're still basically going to be done through a friendly approach. Now, in terms of China, it's very complex because we do have extensive relations with China. It's quite clear on the economic front, on the investments and trade, especially on trade, where China remains our biggest trading partner. In fact, trades in their favor. And we have extensive economic relations with them, and even on people-to-people contacts and investment, infrastructure, etc. So our relationship, in fact, when we deal with China, we say that our differences on the West Philippine Sea is not the sum total of our relationship with China. So in other words, this is a very complex and dynamic relationship. But of course, we have differences on the West Philippine Sea, but we will not let that issue dominate our entire relationship with China. And I think many countries in the world have the same approach, even the United States, which has a rivalry with China, but they do have extensive economic cooperation. So I think in that sense, we will see how we can maintain cooperation with China in areas we will benefit, but at the same time, we will alert them to any differences or issues which continue to cause serious concern to us, and this includes the issues or what's happening in the West Philippine Sea. And in addressing that issue, of course, the Department of Foreign Affairs, when it addresses those issues, is of course limited to our mandate. And our mandate merely, basically, is to resolve differences through diplomacy. And there are many diplomatic options which we are already trying with China. We have tried. But of course, the solution cannot be achieved overnight, and it really requires a whole-of-government approach. But in our case, we have dealt with the various concerns on the South China Sea, for example, through the traditional protests, diplomatic notes. We've also, and we have a number of mechanisms now bilaterally where we deal with China. Especially, we have a mechanism devoted purely to West Philippine Sea issues, and we also have the standard consultations between ministries, between foreign ministries, etc., plus regular informal contacts with them. So these are all going on, regularly, and in these meetings, we always state our concerns when it comes to the West Philippine Sea, but at the same time, try and enhance our relationship in those areas where we are both benefiting. So in that sense, we are doing this. Of course, China is not the China of the 1970s. China has definitely strategic interests, especially in our region, and I think it's going to assert them as long as they feel it's necessary. And it seems that that will be their approach, at least in the coming years. And of course, we have to contend with it. But of course, not only the Philippines, the ASEAN countries are also in a very similar position, as well as other countries in the region, Japan, Korea, and even Australia. So we're also working together with those countries in various platforms to address these this regional issue. So in other words, perhaps what I'm saying is we are really undertaking a multifaceted approach. There are many efforts taking place to see how we can protect and promote our interests, and therefore try and see how we can, by so doing, at least promote our economic and political security. So in other words, we are certainly taking many efforts depending on the particular issue, at least bilaterally, regionally, and even in the UN.
Many thanks, Dr. Oreta and Secretary Manalo, for your insights on that particular issue. So our next question, this is directed to, okay, we have one. Okay, yes, you may go ahead. All right.
Good afternoon. My name is Rui Moreno. My question is more directed to Dr. Aldaba, and maybe it also fits in with this issue of China relations, because I noticed that in the discussion about the economic benefits of these groupings, regional groupings that we have joined or we should join, like RCEP, etc., all the benefits have been given. But perhaps I missed it, but I have not seen any similar comments regarding, if we were to closer to China in terms of the groupings, what are the benefits, if any, and how do we weigh it against RCEP, like the Belt and Road, etc.? Thank you.
Well, for the Belt and Road, I think we were given certain loans for some bridges, but we still need to get more from China. Although maybe the Secretary has more updates on what benefits we are getting from China through the Belt and Road Initiative. For RCEP, it's we haven't ratified a membership in RCEP.
All I'm just saying is it's the perception or the orientation which seems to say, oh, here, we're giving you a lot of data on RCEP, etc., etc. But there's nothing on Belt and Road in terms of an association, or working on it on a total basis, not only on the loans, etc. And if you say there's none, then it's okay. But then I think it shows this orientation we have, that we immediately look towards the traditional allies that we have had, rather than really looking seriously at Russia or China. And I'm not saying we should go in that direction, but I think when we have these discussions, perhaps we should also have that as a comparator. That's all I'm just trying to say. Thank you.
Well, I think the Secretary already mentioned that, for example, China, our relationship is just not the issue on West Philippine Sea. In fact, I don't have the statistics, but we are economically also quite tied to China. So that means that we really cannot sever ties with them, because economically we are very much involved with China, and so is China with us. Although, of course, we're a smaller country than China, but Your Secretary.
Well, just to add, of course, the situation now, I'm sure as everyone knows, it's certainly not like in the Cold War, but it's certainly complex, more complex with the rivalry between the U.S. and China. But, for example, on the Belt and Road, yes, the Philippines joined almost hundreds of other countries in the Belt and Road Initiative. But frankly, Belt and Road Initiative is, in a way, quite nebulous. It's not like the RCEP or it's consists of individual projects. And the Philippines has a couple, but there's not really something, for example, a project. Here, for example, there was a bridge project in Davao, which is completed. The Chinese say it's Belt and Road, but actually there was no Belt and Road. It was a bilateral thing, but for them, any project is Belt and Road. And there have been difficulties in other countries, like Sri Lanka, for example, in projects. So when we enter into a project under Belt and Road, we analyze it on the basis of that particular project and whether we would benefit or not. And there have been cases where maybe it was difficult to complete the project. So that's how we would do it. But Belt and Road is not like, for example, the RCEP. Now, the RCEP is another story. China is a member of the RCEP. And in fact, I hope the Philippines ratifies it. The president is in favor of ratification. And of course, we hope the Senate has to concur, because we are now the only country of the original signatories who is not yet ratified even though we negotiated in the thing. And the benefits are really, at least theoretically, outweigh the costs. But we have to convince Congress, the Senate, of this. But certainly RCEP has potential because it will become really the largest trade grouping, definitely in Asia. I don't know the world, because the TPP is at the moment not functioning. So RCEP will certainly have great potential because it includes all the ASEAN countries, and then of course the other big countries in Asia. So that's the benefit of RCEP, and we see benefits. And if the Senate does ratify or concurs the ratification, then I'm sure that we would, at least in the executive branch. But of course, the legislature sometimes has different ideas. But we will have to work with them to get it ratified. So that's on the point of RCEP. Now, the U.S. has this new one, the IPEF, but it's not exactly clear what the U.S. hopes to do with it. It's still a political document, still being negotiated. But probably everyone sees it maybe as a kind of counter to the Belt and Road. As the U.S., because the U.S. used to convince us that there's not only one belt, one road, there are many roads and many belts. China says there is one belt and one road, but it's extensive, goes around. So anyway, what we tend to do is where we can benefit, we will benefit. For example, this financing of the AIB under the Belt and Road was viewed as an alternative, for example, to ADB. If you get better terms, use one. So in our view, the more you have, the more options we have to try and address our needs.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Aldaba and Secretary Manalo, for your insights on the contours of our economic relationship with China. So we have a final question here. It's submitted online, but also essentially an iteration on Dr. Abao's questions in her reaction. So, Secretary Manalo, how would you respond to Dr. Abao's questions essentially on what is the appropriate mechanism for global governance of migrants given conflicting North-South concerns?
Thank you. Well, I think the Global Compact really for us, the Philippines, is probably at least the most effective multilateral instrument at this stage. Because if I could go back, because I was involved, in fact, in the creation first of the GFMD. And in fact, the whole idea of the GFMD was to get the countries with interests in migration together, because we found that the UN would be deadlocked, because you have countries who are opposed to, for example, having a separate, let's say, a separate document on the rights of migrant workers, because they feel it shouldn't be a separate document. Yet they want rights of other groupings to be, let's say, identified in a separate treaty or document, but they didn't want to do migrant workers or migrants as such. So we went to the Global Forum on Migration and Development, and that has developed into the Global Compact. And in fact, the number of countries who are in the Global Compact now is increasing, because it includes even a number of developed countries who see the importance of migrants in their society and the need to not only to protect their rights, but to promote them. So at this stage, I would say at the multilateral level, the Global Compact is the most effective. But at the same time, we want to increase the number of countries who subscribe to it, and that's the challenge, because it still exists. Many of the European countries are not really open to it. So that's at the multilateral level. But even in ASEAN, we look at the issue at the regional level. So we're trying to work at all levels. And so I have to say, at least at this stage, the Global Compact at the multilateral level remains our best instrument for promoting the rights, even though, of course, it's not universal. And that's, of course, a problem. But I suppose that's another issue. We'll need another forum on whether an instrument which is legally binding or not is. But I think that's a debate. I mean, I'd be happy to come here again and debate it. But I think that's a pretty complex issue. And maybe I could also add some of the points were raised earlier on the Department of BMW. My colleague here, Secretary Ople, maybe should be here. But no, I just want to assure everyone that the Foreign Affairs and the Department of Migrant Workers are working as closely as possible to see how we can work together. As the President said, we have to work with each other and complement each other because this new department has been created, so we have to work together. But just let me say that in terms of the embassies and how we would work abroad, I think it's quite clear that the head of post in our foreign embassies is the ambassador. And the ambassador will still have the responsibility for any activity undertaken in that particular post. So whether we have attachés of different agencies, like in trade, tourism, in this case, or migrant workers, they will all, at least administratively, have to go through the ambassador. And in that sense, we are involved. Now, there will, of course, be a distinction. Maybe the attachés, where they have attachés on migrant workers, they will deal with the OFWs as such. But as mentioned, we will then be dealing with the OFs, and there are also quite a lot of OFs. These include all kinds of Filipinos who are not, because there's a strict definition of what an OFW is. So these will all be taking place, let's say, in a single post. So we will obviously have to work together, and the president has maintained the one team, one country, one team approach, and that's what we will do. And so that's how we're going to work. Of course, there are other areas where we're working out with the DMW, how we'll approach it, but when it comes to the foreign posts, the ambassador is still going to be the head of the post, and communications and actions will still have to go through his or her desk.
Thank you very much, Secretary Manalo, particularly for your thoughts on the Global Compact. So jumping off from that question, and this time directing it to Dr. Abao, could you speak to the feasibility of your proposed migration policy? Sorry. Could you speak to the feasibility of your proposed migration policy? Like how, well, I think this is from a student, I think, so I translated it a little bit. How feasible is your proposed migration policy? So that was submitted.
Sorry. Do I hold it? Okay. Let me just be clear that the proposed migration policy is really not to further it, right? And to develop the domestic economy, but that would really entail a lot of planning, no? And industrial policy in terms of really looking at, of course, how you will position yourself as an economy vis-a-vis the global political economy. But I think the very basic is to be able to identify what industries are we going to promote, what will be the winning industry, so to speak. Okay. Of course, mining, as discussed by Dr. Aldaba, that's really a point for discussion kasi parang ang konsepto ay, sige magmina ka, pero yung talagang, you keep the resources here and you process it here, you add value to it here, and therefore you will have a manufacturing sector, hindi lang yung extraction. But again, there's always a debate because extraction is still involved. But I think the entire idea is really to go into some sort of industrial policy or to plan really where the jobs will come from. So it's not, the issue is no longer labor policy, it's job generation. So.
Okay, thank you. So my mic had to be adjusted for a bit. So thank you very much for all of your reactions. So unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for questions. Whenever one holds an event like this, the organizers are always apprehensive of the fact that maybe there might not be enough substantive questions, but always at the end we have more questions than time. So at this point, I would like to invite our panelists and Secretary Manalo to make their final statements of around 2 minutes each to cap off our event. So we can begin with Dr. Aldaba, followed by Dr. Urata, Dr. Abao, and finally Secretary Manalo.
We heard the discussions, and we saw that foreign policy is such a complex activity now. Add to that the volatile and the uncertain environment. So I just wish the Secretary good luck.
Sige, thank you. We thank the good Secretary for the very candid and frank discussion. We recognize the issues and challenges confronting our foreign policy are really complex and layered. Security particularly has become more complicated with the increasing interconnectedness of economies, institutions, and peoples, and problems have also become borderless. Security issues now require more innovative and comprehensive solution. For instance, terrorist financing requires not just regional but international cooperation of states, agencies, and organizations. So out-of-the-box thinking and innovative ideas and solutions must be explored to solve these wicked problems. And we hope that the lines of communication between the DFA and the Ateneo de Manila University remain open. And please know, Mr. Secretary, that we are always ready to share our views and recommendations with the department.
We're already very advanced in migration policy and governance. Actually, ang Pilipinas gold standard na pagdating sa migration management. But the points I raised earlier were not just about improving what we already have, but really rethinking what we really want as a nation moving forward. So what do we want to see or happen? Because the way the direction is going now, it's really like ease of doing migration. Kumbaga kung may ease of doing business, ito yan lahat, yung digitization, even the new department, that's ease of doing migration. So the question is, do we want to do that, to continually do that? In fact, when you talk about what's the long-term policy, yung migration has already been the long-term policy because 50 years is a lot of years. So do we want to continue that in the next 50 years, for example? Or do we try something else, like, as I said, focusing on domestic job creation? And of course, thank you very much, Secretary Manalo, for joining us.
Well, thank you very much. I don't know if I can summarize everything in 2 minutes, but first to say I'm very happy to have been here, and that certainly the lines of communication between Ateneo and Department of Foreign Affairs will always be open, so please feel free to contact us, and or even having some events like this in the future on some maybe specific issues. I think, as mentioned, I hope I was able to project that the foreign policy is a complex thing, and it basically, our policy is formulated through consensus building, and I think many of the issues that we're contend with in the Foreign Office and foreign policy is to address domestic needs. For example, economic security, development, trade, even migration, which is basically employment, and so much of this starts from our needs at home, and our job is how to address them or achieve them through diplomatic means with our partners, and that is the challenge that we always face. So basically, it's a combination of domestic and foreign policy, which is really the key. And of course, the support of the people here are very important, but it's also necessary to develop consensus on our policies, because many of these issues are really quite complex. And then from there, once we have developed a kind of approach, then it's our job to see how we can address them. But anyway, I just want to conclude by saying that I was very happy to be here this afternoon, and I hope I was able to give you an idea of some of the issues that we have to contend with, whether they be economic, political, or of a social nature. And that the Foreign Office on a daily basis, of course, has to deal with all these issues. So once again, to thank you for having invited me this afternoon, and certainly I look forward to, hopefully in the near future, getting together again in this kind of format. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing your insights and expertise with us, Secretary Manalo, of course, and Dr. Aldaba, Dr. Areta, and Dr. Abao. And now, to formally conclude our event, we would like to hear from Mr. Howie Severino, who will be speaking on the behalf of the Severino family. So if you may invite you to the podium.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for the clarity of your thoughts. And thank you, professors, for the insightful responses. On behalf of the Severino family, my deepest gratitude to Ateneo de Manila University, the Department of Foreign Affairs, and the Carlos P. Romulo Foundation for making this event come true. My brother, Rodolfo Severino III, has already introduced himself, but many Severinos are also watching online in Singapore, Scotland, the US, in Negros Occidental, in Baguio, in Manila, and my son in Cervini Hall on the Loyola campus. A shout out to all of you and thank you for attending as well. This annual lecture was actually the brainchild of former Foreign Secretary Bobby Romulo, who sadly passed away early this year. Tito Bobby had first broached the idea of a Severino professorial chair at my father's wake in April 2019. As sharp and perceptive as Tito Bobby was, he must have known that a project to set up a memorial fund in my father's name with an annual lecture on foreign policy at the Ateneo was a perfect marriage of two institutions that my father loved with all his heart: his alma mater and the Foreign Service. But ideas are often only as great as their follow-through. And I wondered then if Tito Bobby would allow his idea to go the way of many others without any follow-through and eventually forgotten. But he was relentless and didn't stop messaging me updates and suggestions about his project for his beloved colleague until the vision became a reality. Even after the endowment was set up, Tito Bobby then went about preparing for the first annual Severino Memorial Lecture in 2021. Despite his declining health, he put together a stellar event last year that featured two former foreign secretaries, Albert Del Rosario of the Philippines and Gareth Evans of Australia, speaking on the most urgent foreign policy issue of our time, the South China Sea. My father would have been very happy and proud of that. He was not into grandiose events, but meaningful ones that deepen our understanding of the vexing issues of our time. So this annual memorial lecture on foreign affairs is a wonderful way to remember his legacy. He was a low-key civil servant for most of his career, then became a public intellectual, book author, and teacher in his latter years. But throughout his life, he was a man of integrity and a patriot, with always the nation's best interest at heart, very much like nearly all his colleagues in the Foreign Service that I met while growing up and have known as an adult, making me proud to be the son of a Filipino diplomat. Maraming salamat at mabuhay tayong lahat.
Thank you very much, Mr. Howie Severino, for those warm words of inspiration and encouragement. And now for our concluding remarks, maybe invite Father Roberto Yap, President of the Ateneo de Manila University, to the podium. Thank you.
Magandang hapon. Before anything else, allow me to express my gratitude to our distinguished speaker for this year's Ambassador Rodolfo C. Severino Jr. Endowment Fund Lecture Series, the Honorable Enrique Manalo. Secretary Manalo, thank you for giving us an overview of our country's foreign policy. It is not only a vital cog in our country's economic and social stability, but our foreign policy also keeps our relations with other countries strong and secure. And in this digital globalization, having a clear and well-defined foreign policy is crucial. I would also like to thank my Ateneo colleagues, Dr. Melay Abao, Dr. Jennifer Ureta, and Dr. Nandi Aldaba, for sharing their views on migration policy, security sector reform, and economic development. Your discussions provided us with a more nuanced view of the very complex matters at hand. My gratitude also goes to the Carlos P. Romulo Foundation for Peace and Development, represented here by Ambassador Tony Basilio, and also the Severino family, represented by Howie and Rodolfo III. I'd also like to thank the different units of the Ateneo who have come together in organizing this event. I think we all agree with Secretary Manalo that shepherding our country on the heels of a crippling global pandemic is daunting enough. But in spite that, we have facing also what he has mentioned, a greatest threat of climate change among the many problems and dilemmas that we face today. Secretary Manolo noted that we are the fourth most vulnerable country to the effects of climate change and one of the most disaster-prone countries of the world. Climate change is a collective challenge and as such needs collective action. I am glad to hear that the new administration of President Marcos Jr. has expressed its commitment to do its part to forestall the ravages brought on by climate change. Any contribution, big or small, counts. In Ateneo de Manila, we pursue sustainability, caring for creation, environmental justice, and one of the ways we do this is by integrating what is called the Laudato Si action platform in our university strategic plan. The initiative refers to the 2015 encyclical of Pope Francis, wherein he calls for a holistic approach to care for our common home by listening to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. The International Association of Jesuit Universities has invited all Jesuit universities all over the world to become Laudato Si universities by engaging in the Laudato Si action platform that tries to meet the 7 Laudato Si goals. Ateneo de Manila in particular is trying to accelerate its push towards carbon neutrality in our campuses by 2030. We are also working towards prioritizing our progress on achieving or helping achieve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. In fact, that is the reason why the last 2 years we entered the Times Higher Education Impact Ratings, which measures the sustainability efforts of universities around the world. We thought that entering such a ranking procedure really is very close to our Jesuit mission of reconciliation with each other, with God, and with creation. And it was also a way to measure ourselves and how we really were working towards meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. Rest assured, Ateneo de Manila will continue to work hard in trying to achieve the SDGs through our teaching, research, campus operations, engagements, and in the formation of our students. Secretary Manalo also touched on the issue of economic transformation and technological advancement and how our government hopes to broaden its engagement beyond traditional partners. Consultations and collaborations across countries, regional, and global levels are indispensable, especially in this age, and will genuinely help ensure and accelerate our country's sustainable growth. In a small way, a few weeks ago, the Ateneo School of Government hosted a roundtable discussion on public-private partnerships. That discussion is just one of the many initiatives and contributions that Ateneo de Manila will commit to helping promote strategic partnerships and collaborations. Our good secretary also shared the government's stance on pressing issues such as the US-China competition, the Ukraine-Russia crisis, and our battle regarding the West Philippine Sea ruling. As Filipinos, we appreciate the government's commitment to preserving and enhancing national security, attaining economic growth, and promoting Filipino rights and well-being here and abroad. COVID-19, climate change, international disputes, inequality, migration, there's really a lot of issues, and the plate of Secretary Manalo and the DFA is certainly very full. But as we look ahead to a new phase of governance, I hope that Secretary Manalo and our discussants have inspired all of us to contribute and to be vigilant, to be concerned, and to be involved. As Filipinos, we all look at these challenges as opportunities to remain conscious and cautious and continue to work together for our common future. Thank you very much, those here on site and online, for joining us in this Ambassador Rodolfo C. Severino Jr. Endowment Fund Lecture. Maraming salamat, magandang hapon sa inyong lahat.
Prof, thanks for those closing remarks. Father Yap. And to repeat what you just said, we would like to thank everyone who has taken the time to join us here on site at Rockwell and also online via the Ateneo YouTube channel. So we would like to take this moment to present tokens of appreciation to today's speakers. Okay, yes. Thank you. So some additional information for our audience. So this book is the latest publication, I believe, of the Ateneo de Manila University Press. It's titled The Marcos Era Reader, I believe, edited by Lea Anastasio and Patricio Abinales. Okay. And for Secretary Manalo, we have an additional token. Okay. One that merits quite an extended introduction. So what we have here, Secretary Manalo, is a statuette of Saint Ignatius of Loyola, founder of the Society of Jesus, pictured, sculpted, laying down his sword at the altar of the Church of Our Lady of Montserrat. So this symbolizes his conversion from a soldier of the earthly kingdom of Spain to being a soldier for God's heavenly kingdom. So in performing this act, Inigo transformed and sacramentalized it, using it as a visible manifestation of his change of heart. So we hope this particular gift can serve as a source of inspiration, perhaps, for the challenges that will undoubtedly come during your term. And again, we wish you good luck with all of that, you and your team, you and the department. Okay. So thank you so much for everyone's participation. So, of course, I cannot forget there are many, many people and offices that we would like to acknowledge. So, first of all, the Ateneo Loyola School. So, Vice President Vilches, thank you very much once again for joining us. The School of Social Sciences, Dean Saloma, thank you. The Ateneo Department of Political Science, led by Dr. Abao. And we really needed the help, and we couldn't have organized this without the help of the University Marketing and Communications Office, so Ma'am Matek, the Office of University Development and Alumni Affairs, led by Ms. Jeng, and of course our partners here in Makati, the Ateneo Professional Schools. We would like to thank the Ateneo Law School for the venue, and the APS Central Facilities Management Office and the Campus Safety and Mobility Office. And lastly, we could not forget the help and support of the Carlos P. Romulo Foundation, in particular Ambassador Basilio. We thank you for your presence here. The Severino family, many thanks. And of course, the Department of Foreign Affairs, Secretary Manalo, and the staff present here today. Thank you. Okay. All right, so I believe that cuts our event, that closes our event. Thank you again for your participation. So I believe for our on-site guests, there might be refreshments outside, but for our panelists, our distinguished guests, we have a quick round of photos. Thank you very much.